Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of the HCD VidCast. So we are going to talk today about disruptive innovation, and specifically around an idea we call the consumer technical model. More about that later, but thanks everybody for joining us. Welcome back to those of you that have been along this journey with us, and welcome to the new people as well. A little bit of background on who we are and what we're doing. Today, we're actually welcoming back Allison Gutkowski. I'm Michelle Niedziela, VP of Research and Innovation at HCD, and I'm here joined with Kathryn and Ambroze, as usual.
Hi, everybody. Yep, I hope this VidCast finds everyone well. I am Kathryn Ambroze, like Michelle said, the manager of behavioral and marketing sciences with the research and innovation team. And we are really excited to welcome back Allison. We had so much fun with her in our last VidCast, so we couldn't wait to have her back.
Back by popular demand.
Allison is our Director of Global Research. Go ahead.
Yep, and as a reminder, I've been with HCD over 8 years now. I am luckily sitting in the beautiful city of Prague today, and I am in charge of more of our consumer and sensory side of the business with my hands in sales and account management.
Yeah. And a little bit of background on us for those of you that are new. HCD is a market research house. We do work globally. We specialize in looking at how the consumer perceives, evaluates, and responds to stimuli using psychological, neuroscience, and traditional market research approaches. Anything from product development to marketing, starting in exploration all the way through validation. So without further ado, let's launch into today's conversation about making a consumer technical model and why it's important, especially when talking about disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation meaning, having new products and new ideas that really break into a consumer's lifestyle. So we're going to start off from the basics before we launch really right into the consumer technical model. But what we do at HCD is really about looking at more than what meets just the surface, more than what just meets the eye of, traditional market research, right?
Right, exactly. And I think that a lot of times people frequently view the idea of conscious and non-conscious as a switch, where it's either on or it's off. And what we try to help explain is that it's more of a continuum, and that, it's they kind of feed into each other. It's more.
Yeah. The example I like to give is, sensory systems or anything that you experience in the world, they form impressions in your brain. So if you hear a sound, the hair cells in your inner ear sense that sound and sends a signal to the brain. And that happens without you even knowing it, right? So that's non-conscious.
Right.
But as your brain starts to figure out what that sound is and give it a name and a value, and you remember it, that starts to become more conscious. Mm-hmm. But why would you want to know that?
Allison, would you want to explain a little bit about that? Like, what do you think really brings the idea of what brings us value to having the hair cells go up without us knowing?
Yeah, so it's great when we're thinking about product development. A lot of the times it's difficult for us to get the why behind why someone might like something, why they chose that preference, or why something is appropriate. Mm-hmm. It's difficult for us to articulate it, thinking about our olfactory senses. It's not something that we speak about or have to put language behind in our day-to-day lives. We're just not good at that and being practiced in that. So
especially when things are similar, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, right? When we're thinking about sensory evaluation, we might be evaluating 4 or 5 different variations of strawberry. And we can tell that they're all different. They're different strawberries. We can tell that they're all strawberry. But for us to be able to articulate why they're different or why we like one over the other, that's really hard for a lay person to do. So by understanding kind of that physiological or more non-conscious type of response within our bodies helps us to be able to better understand why we may be responding a certain way, what is it about that specific prototype, for example, that's driving this type of response or this type of emotional connection
Exactly.
or just physiological experience?
Yeah, and you might think of it, so give it a concrete example. So if you were to have a certain frequency of a ringtone for your cell phone, that might actually make you behave quicker, right? So maybe you'll be more likely to pick up the phone, or maybe you're faster at picking up the phone because you recognize it quicker, right? I think an example might even be, thinking about this is like Apple, for example, doesn't allow you to use other ringtones. They have their set, right? So it's kind of like branded. So that learning that you have with the familiarity of the Apple ringtones versus Android, which could be anything, right? That actually may have a stronger effect on your behavior because it is a set with its own perceptions, right? So it can affect you non-consciously. That's going to ultimately affect your conscious behavior.
Right. So basically, there's different components to the idea of a ringtone that could help you to behave differently.
Absolutely.
Which makes sense. I mean, keeping it as simple as like volume could influence it.
Yeah. Familiarity, tone, whatever it might be, could feed into changing those behaviors. And so there's a difference, right, between looking at that non-conscious and cognitive response. And so Allison knows a lot about this, but traditionally in market research, the way that you do it is through surveys, and you don't know what's going on in the mind of someone, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
As much as I joke, I can't mind read yet.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about, a piece of stimuli, whether it be a commercial or an ad or a product, right? Our stimuli has so many different inputs to it, from the color, texture, sound, the sensorial experience. When we're thinking about communications, visual components to it, the size of the text, the font, everything is communicating to us. And there's so many different elements that go into that piece of stimuli. Yet what we get in that cognitive response, right? What are consumers?
A 5 out of 7, right? What does that even mean? Like, how did the consumer decide? It's a 5, right?
Right.
So that's a black box. We have no idea what went on inside of them to say this one's a 5, this one's a 6. Or if we look at the aggregate, right, of 100 people, 200 people, it's 5.1 versus 4.9, right? So what are the differences between those two things?
So it's really trying to get at the idea of the inner workings. And if you can't, if people can't give you an explanation of that, it starts to, get a little confusing and raise some questions.
Exactly.
Well, then you get into the idea of, we're in a research environment. You're asking me to comment on the specific font within this logo. How much are we really just, trying so hard to get at answers when, our consumer just might not be able to articulate or necessarily care.
Yeah, that's true too. Engaging them.
Or be aware that these things are even impacting them.
How can we go about understanding the consumer? That's really what the consumer technical model is about. It's using different methodologies to understand the consumer's needs and how they interact with products that goes beyond what the typical more traditional market research does. And more on a grander scale, rather than just looking at one project, consumer technical model is basically like building a chassis of understanding, right? A chassis meaning like that inner workings of the car, right? That all the car parts are going to sit on. That chassis, getting that understanding, that basic understanding of the consumer, to then be able to take that knowledge across multiple projects, right?
Right. So you're saying, just for clarity, what would you say the goal then of the consumer technical model is?
I always say it's kind of like having a pipeline of product innovations, right? So by having this understanding of the consumer, then you can apply it across, projects that are going to go for like several years, right? So you don't have to keep measuring the consumer. You have a basic understanding that you can sort of filter everything through. Is that what you think, Allison?
Yeah, absolutely. I say, starting at really that ground level, from the most rudimentary understanding of our consumer, which we'll get into in a second, but starting so basic and not trying to rely on so much past knowledge that you might think that you have, or assumptions that you've made as a brand about your consumers, but let's really hear from them on the very most basic aspect of their routine within your product category.
I think especially when we're talking about disruptive innovation, right? Because it's really about identifying the consumer needs and disrupting their lifestyle and innovating around all that understanding. So you really have to understand your consumers' behaviors in order to make any sort of real innovations, right?
Right. And to make it even, just to push that a little further, you want to know their current needs rather than what their needs may have been, say, 10 years ago.
Right. Yeah. And so that model is something you can continue to build on. But it is really understanding about the consumer's behaviors, very consumer focused, right? Which is something that I think has been missing probably in the past 50 years of consumer research, where things became more product focused. This is really about focusing on the consumer and what are their behaviors, what's the language they use. And that's really about habit. Yeah.
Right. Of course.
So what is habit? Well, we're talking about like the lifestyles people lead, and brands and products are just a huge part of the consumer lifestyle. And our lifestyles are really built on the habits that we have, how we interact with the world, how we go through our day. And the habits are really got three parts to the cycle, right? The cues, which triggers the habit to start. And then the routine, how we go about performing that habit. And the reward, or why we want to keep doing the habit, what makes us do it at all, right? So if you think about anything like, let's say, eating a snack, right? So what's the cue? Maybe it's hunger. Maybe it's habit, meaning timing of day, right? Or maybe what's the routine? Is it, if you're at work, is it something that you keep in your desk, or do you actually make a trip to the cafeteria or leave the office? So
it's context often triggers this habit to get started.
Yeah. And then, how do you go about eating it? Is it something you have to do quickly? Is it something you take the time to do? Do you eat it with other things? And does it make you feel good, right? What's the reward? What makes you want to continue to eat that snack? Is it that it satisfies your hunger, or that it makes you feel positive or more healthy? That's how you kind of build that habit, and it's a cycle, right? So one thing leads to another. So when we're thinking about understanding consumers, you really got to understand all those key pieces.
Right. And it's from an emotional perspective. It's from a rational perspective. It's from a socioeconomic type of perspective. It's all these different lenses and, areas within our life that we're constantly playing with that really feed into these habits. And thinking about what Kathryn said, the context, right? We can think about how our habits are different when we're talking about different times of day or occasions or locations. Everything that we do really plays into and plays off of our routines and our lifestyles and our habits.
And when we talk about this being consumer focused and not product focused, if we were focusing on the snack itself, we'd be talking about how this bag of potato chips is particularly crispy, or this bag of potato chips, the calorie content or whatever it might be, focusing on the actual chips. But when we're focusing on the consumer, we want to know exactly what you're talking about, Allison. Like, what are the emotions? What are the cues? How do they use it? How would they describe it? So that's why we want to use the focus groups to get consumer language, and not the jargon that we use in R&D to talk about sensory aspects, right? So when we talk about mouthfeel or something like that, well, the consumer might find that mouthfeel is very important, and we're not saying you shouldn't study that. But when we're looking at this very habitual thing and this very psychological based approach, then it's important to get how the consumer talks about it, right?
Of course. And I think also by using the consumer language, you're also getting a better insight into what they're expecting from their product.
Mm-hmm. And we do that through the focus groups.
Right. But it doesn't always have to be focus groups, right? We know budgets exist. When we get into the consumer technical model as a whole, there's multiple steps, and sometimes doing all of these steps just isn't going to be feasible or possible from a budget or timing perspective. So exploring that language through social media mining, or looking at different blog posts or Reddit applications, or even using past research that our client has already done, and looking for this cue routine reward language through that can also be a solution for understanding the consumer language and what they're calling these different, let's say, rewards.
When you use their language, it often, reveals opportunities that you may not have seen had you focused on the product, right? And identifying those opportunities helps us develop nudges. And that's so nudges are a behavioral economic term about how to sort of disrupt that behavior, right? So slightly change their behavior. If they've always done chips and you want to move them to crackers, well, what is it that we can learn about consumers to nudge them in the direction of crackers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we go about understanding that? Those of you that are familiar with us have probably heard of some of this before, but it's like a three-step sort of process where we first want to identify the needs, then we want to get the consumer certainty around those needs with the product or brand, and then develop the nudge. So let's talk a little bit about what we do to identify the needs.
Right.
Yeah, so
you go ahead, Allison.
Sure. So a great way to identify needs and those top needs and prioritize them is we take that language that we've learned from whether it be our focus groups or other exploration, and we use a very traditional approach via MaxDiff. And for those who aren't familiar, MaxDiff is essentially a forced choice exercise that's going to help us prioritize many different things. So as you can imagine, from our exploration, we're going to get a pretty sizable list between cues, routines, and rewards. And it's difficult for consumers to prioritize such a large list. So an exercise such as MaxDiff helps us do that.
Right. So like having me say, okay, what's more important to me, that it is relaxing or that it's affordable?
Yep. It's much easier for you to make that type of decision than when I give you a list of 35 different choices.
Yeah. So the next stage is identifying the perceptions, right? So we want to get the perceptions and compare that. So what is the consumer actually experiencing versus what they need? So if we look at, for example, this is again looking at snacks, we've got chocolate, nuts, and chips. Well, how do people perceive those things for those same sort of ideas that we used in the MaxDiff? And we use implicit association to get at that. So if you'd like to learn more about that, we have some white papers you can download, or you can visit the vidcast we did on implicit, but it's a methodology that we use to see what sort of strength of association do people see for the different samples or products or brands or whatever it might be. So here you can see that chocolate is not really very relaxing to people, but chips they find more relaxing, right? So this is a difference. But the important part is to see the gap between the top need is relaxation, but chocolate wasn't meeting the relaxation need, right?
Right. That makes sense.
So then the next step after that is then assessing the certainty. So how strongly do people feel that association? What's the sort of critical mass of consumers that agree with that? So by looking at the percentage of people that respond that yes, chips are relaxing and how strongly they associate it with. So if we have, 80% of consumers find chips relaxing and it's a strong association, well, that's a huge thing for chips, right? Mm-hmm. But if we want to make an improvement for chocolate, then being able to see that, okay, it's a moderate association for something like luxurious taste, but it has, 60% of people or greater than 60% of people means that, okay, a lot of people agree that chocolate is luxurious, but we could actually move it up pretty easily, right? So a lot of people agree that the strength of that association isn't really high. If we just say changed our communication a bit to really link chocolate with luxury, then you could probably increase that perception.
It's the low-hanging fruit of our opportunities, if you will, that combination of a low or moderate association and a high certainty. Mm-hmm. It's something that's easier to nudge, easier to move that association.
So something as simple as like an advertisement that talks about luxury, or maybe having more luxurious font or imagery on the package could give people that idea, right? Mm-hmm. So this is, again, first you're identifying the opportunities and then you're developing those nudges, right?
Yeah. And it helps right prioritize. Our clients don't have a lack of innovation ideas. Oftentimes it's trying to prioritize and shuffle through those different ideas of what's going to really fit this opportunity, what makes most sense for this opportunity, and for our brand as well. What type of movement, when we think about the brand, is going to make most sense for us? What weight can we carry?
Mm-hmm.
So
once we identify that, and it's like, okay, here's the low hanging fruit that we want to move forward with, we want to make sure that it still matches with the brand, right? So we can create, R&D is great. They can make any product. So let's say the product is going to be more luxurious, which is the concept, right? So we can link those twos. But what about the brand? If it's a budget brand, advertising for luxury may not be a good fit, right?
Right. Michelle, you were thinking just like what I was thinking, is you want it to be this cohesive experience where everything is kind of playing off of each other to build the strengths that you want for those opportunities that are yet to be met.
Exactly. So we want to do some sort of validation, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay. And can you cater this research to better fit your question? Because I see here that we have both the opportunity for a self-assessment mannequin and implicit. So it seems like some projects may want to, depending on what the question is, want to look at intensity of a product experience, while others may want to focus, like the previous example, on perceptions. So it can
there's a lot of different ways you can go about validating that you're achieving what you're looking to achieve, right? So if you're trying to, look at something emotional, like an emotional change, you might want to use something like the self-assessment mannequin, which again, if you want to visit our vidcast on that, please feel free to go back and look at the YouTube channel. But let's say it's more of a concept, right, for an idea like fun or luxury, then a better fit is going to be through something like implicit testing. So you can test specific words to make sure that that's a match. And then ultimately you can make a scorecard to make sure that you are achieving, say, those associations, you are having harmonization with the brand, and you still want to do your traditional approaches like traditional hedonics for liking, etc. And you can make it a scorecard to make sure that you've validated that overall experience. It has to be well liked, it has to meet the concept, and it has to be a fit for that brand.
Okay, so so the scorecard is basically a summary of the experience?
And a way to compare different prototypes, right? So being able to very clearly, as you can see here, that prototype B is outperforming the other two.
Right.
And how do we come up with the scoring system? What do these numbers all mean?
So it's very dependent on the project we're working on, right? So it could be the number of associations that we're trying to meet, the number of concepts. There could be, a fit to the brand, meaning like how many of those associations does the brand actually meet? Like what is the perception of the brand? And so then comparing that with the product to see where they overlap. And the traditional hedonics, usually people have sort of an action standard, as they're called, right? So it needs to score, a certain number out of, 7 on a Likert scale to even be considered. So then all those things go into the scorecard to see, okay, did it meet at least this number of associations? Did it meet at least this number for being associated with the brand? Did it meet at least this number for traditional hedonics? And then we add that up and do a comparison.
So it's predetermined success criteria made in collaboration with the client.
Yes, absolutely. Because each client has different, situations and needs. Some really value the liking scale or maybe the purchase intent scale. And so we might give more weight to that, right? Or maybe because this is a very high profile brand that people are extremely loyal to, you might want to put more weight on the brand harmony side, right? So you don't alienate your consumer. So when we gather all this information, then that's how we can sort of feed it into this pipeline of products, right? So we've we've built a consumer technical model by, the base at the bottom is that you have to understand your consumers' needs and expectations. From that understanding and those measures, we can then get to be able to identify the need gaps and opportunities. And then once we understand the opportunities and how the consumers behave in their habits, that feeds into building an actual consumer technical model where you can start addressing those need gaps, addressing those behaviors, those cues, routines, rewards, and have a research program that has multiple projects that can go on for years, right?
Right. So really, to summarize all of this, it's really that idea of, is this product meeting what the consumer is looking for? Is it meeting the promise?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Specifically, as we go through and make these slight changes, that could be a totally new product, or it could be a change to an ingredient. All those things still have to fit the consumer technical model because that's built on the consumer's needs. So again, being very consumer focused and not product focused.
And now more than ever, our consumers, though, are changing at a rapid pace. So how do we keep our consumer technical model relevant and changing with the times as well? Is there things that we can do that aren't as large and robust, like doing, going back and doing more focus groups? What can we do that's rather abbreviated and short that can really keep this relevant?
I think that you can do tracking of the max implicit approach, right? So that max diff, paired with the implicit, you can sort of do it maybe quarterly or, whatever seems to fit for your particular type of product or brand, but sort of gauge it over time to see, are consumers shifting? Because they do shift, right? Maybe something happens in the world, maybe your competitor comes out with some new idea, but your consumers are going to shift a little bit and their needs are going to shift. So being able to track how those needs shift and how their perceptions shift is important. But just keep adding and feeding it into that consumer technical model so that you can sort of adjust with it. So that is to address our consumer technical model approach, and I want to thank Allison for joining us again. So I hope this was interesting for you. Please feel free to check out our blog to get more information on consumer technical model, as well as follow us on Twitter, where Kathryn posts a lot of really great scientific research stuff. Join us on LinkedIn. Please subscribe to this show on YouTube. And we hope to have you join us again sometime. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.